Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Panay. In today's podcast, we'll be focusing our discussion on relationships. In particular, we'll be looking at a section in the Course in Miracles called Obstacles to Peace, and we'll be looking at one of the main obstacles to getting along with others. I'll be reading from an essay I wrote called Release the Hounds, and it is taken from my book Alchemists of Suburbia, A Course in Miracles, Psychology, and the Art of Integration. As is often the case, the inspiration for writing this essay came from a variety of sources, and one of those sources, as you'll see, is the work of Kate Bush. So without further ado, let's get into the essay. Release the Hounds. I'm a big fan of Kate Bush, the English singer-songwriter who emerged on the music scene in the late 70s. I don't own the whole catalogue of her music, just a few tracks which I really love. One of those tracks is Hounds of Love. The recording starts with a man sounding desperate and alarmed. "It's in the trees! It's coming!" This sets the scene. The hounds of love are something to be feared. The song is about being afraid to fall in love because of the pain and confusion that accompanies relationships. Said Kate in an interview, "The ideas for Hounds of Love, the title track, are very much to do with love itself and people being afraid of it. The idea of wanting to run away from love, not to let love catch them and trap them, in case the hounds might want to tear them to pieces. And it's very much using the imagery of love as something coming to get you, and you've got to run away from it or you won't survive." End of quote. Subtitle: The Hungry Dogs of Fear. One of the most dramatic passages in A Course in Miracles also uses the imagery of hounds frantically seeking out their prey. It occurs in the section The Obstacles to Peace, in which we're told that the first obstacle to peace is our desire to get rid of it. While we might think we want peace, we don't want to lose the specialness of our separate ego self. We want to stay away from God, and that means, despite our protestations to the contrary, that we don't want the peace of God. This resistance to peace is expressed through a grievance, the little remnant of attack you cherish still against your brother, as the Course says. We might have been working with the Course for many years, having let go of a lot of stuff, yet there are likely to be a few choice grievances that still serve as effective defences against peace. We cherish these, quote, little barriers of sand, these walls of dust, because they seem to be limited in scope, well circumscribed and isolated. So the point here, these little, seemingly isolated, well circumscribed grievances that we have just towards these people or that person, but not towards anybody else, in our minds, perceiving them as well-contained little grievances, we think we can get away with having them. And as long as most of the time we're pleasant and feel good towards everybody else, we think that these little well-contained grievances won't affect our peace, aren't a big deal. But, as the Course says, to oppose God's will by a little limits our awareness of the whole as much as opposing it by a lot. And the whole here I'm referring to is the wholeness of God's oneness, the wholeness of his love and peace. St. John of the Cross had a great analogy for this. Just as a bird tied to a branch by 5 pieces of string still can't fly away if 4 pieces are cut, so too are we bound to our ego identification if we cherish one scrap of evil, as the Course says, or one microscopic remnant of the belief in sin. When we choose against God's will and for the ego instead, the fear we experience has us looking for a scapegoat onto whom we can project our guilt. We experience a great emotional need to blame someone else for our lack of peace. We need to perceive a perpetrator so we can feel morally superior and abate our fear. The Course talks about fear's messengers, the, quote, hungry dogs of fear, being sent out in a, quote, savage search for sin. And here's a quote from that section in the Obstacles to Peace. The messengers of fear are harshly ordered to seek out guilt and cherish every scrap of evil and of sin that they can find. No little shred of guilt escapes their hungry eyes, and in their savage search for sin, they pounce on any living thing they see and carry it screaming to their master to be devoured. End of quote. I love the descriptiveness here in the course. It's like something out of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a gothic tale of horror. But I think the course is emphasising the viciousness of the ego thought system. It is like a gothic tale of horror itself. Carrying on. In essence, fear's messengers return with, quote, words of bones and skin and flesh, end of quote, which means that we only see evidence confirming that someone is a body, limited to the insecurities, aggression, and complexities of human nature. If you are nothing more than the domineering, insensitive, jealous, unreasonable, self-centered, fill in the blank, person I think you are, then I too am only a body. And this is the secret attraction to making a big deal about the ego actions that we perceive anyway in others. The secret attraction to not being able to see beyond the form of what someone does to the call for help behind it is that we get to maintain our identification with our body, with form as well. And that is pleasure to the ego. Carrying on. To equate ourselves with the body leads to depression because it denies the wholeness of our spiritual self and the reality of God's unchanging oneness. So yes, although it might lead to immediate feelings of pleasure, a perverse kind of pleasure in being able to point the finger at someone as a victimizer, as disturbing your peace, ultimately it leads to depression. I'd just like to give an example here. It relates to fire walking. So we're a little bit off topic from relationships, but I hope to kind of weave this in to get an idea of the pleasure followed by depression kind of scenario. Once heard a woman talking about how she did fire walking in this weekend workshop, and when it came to the actual fire walking time, after she walked across and, unscathed and let go of her fears and all of that kind of thing, she felt exuberant. She was it was like the most exuberant feeling she's ever had. She was exhilarated. And then she said, but the next day she felt really depressed. And you might say, well, that's a big come down from that big experience. But if you look at it in terms of A Course in Miracles, the depression was the result of feeling delighted that her body could walk across these coals and not be harmed. In other words, it was the whole process was making a big deal about the body. Even if you look at it in terms of the psychological body, having the courage, the kind of mind over matter aspect of fire walking, that's still the will and effort of the individual ego-based will. I will train myself so I can and do this. So it was inevitable that she would feel a deep disturbing depression after having this worldly success, this success that affirmed something to her about the pleasures of having a body, psychological body and a physical body in the world and what it could do, what it could triumph over. Ultimately, that's reminiscent of believing we triumphed over God in creating a separate self housed in our mind in a body. Now, in a relationship, when we accuse somebody else of being the reason for our lack of peace, so they are a bad person, that is limiting them to their body. That's affirming that their body is real, our body is real, but we'll also have a sense of triumph over them in being able to point the finger at them. So this sense of triumph associated with identifying them with a body and ourselves with a body is also reminiscent of the sense of triumph of separating ourselves from God, again, only in our belief because it couldn't happen, so it never happened, but that's not what we believe. We believe it did happen. That's why we have the miserable experience that we do in the world, where our peace is disturbed by anything and everything because we are so identified with the body. But anyway, so that sense of triumph that we have over someone else and that transitory sense of satisfaction that we have in being able to point the finger will lead inevitably to depression if not corrected by the Holy Spirit, if we don't open our minds to correcting our unforgiveness. Now, carrying on, I'm going to reread that last sentence. To equate ourselves with the body leads to depression because it denies the wholeness of our spiritual self and the reality of God's unchanging oneness. The body's senses speak of differentiation, opposites, and mortality. Rooting our identity to the body therefore makes the thought of death and destruction real, and the reality of God's love a thing of fantasy. Feeling depressed, however, we don't recognise the cause and attribute it instead to the grievance at hand, thus perpetuating a vicious cycle. I was angry because of what you did, and now I'm depressed because of it too, we might think. The little remnant we hold against someone can thereby develop a life of its own, growing as our pain and depression grows, along with our chance of if only. We believe the grass would be greener if some aspect of our outer existence changed. From the perspective of the Holy Spirit, which sees the illusory nature of anything less than the wholeness of the spiritual self, there is only ever one answer for a lack of peace in the here and now. Quote, there is no order of difficulty in miracles, for they are all the same. Each is a gentle winning over from the appeal of guilt to the appeal of love. And we might say from the appeal of triumph to the appeal of love. Subtitle, The Messengers of Love. While guilt and fear motivate us to send out messengers in search of sin, the Holy Spirit would give us love's messengers to send instead. These would help us to see beyond the body, beyond differences and the form of someone's behaviour, to the call for help behind an attack. Often this is a call that echoes our own, having believed we separated from love. In this recognition of our mutual interest, our focus moves beyond what has been said and done to our shared spiritual need. Love's messengers help us to become more balanced in our perceptions. The ego's blinkered sight seeks for sin and ignores any evidence to the contrary, leading to painful misunderstandings. I suspect we've all had the experience of saying something without malice or an intention to demean, but been met with a totally unexpected response of fury or indignation, as if we'd said something that was an attack. If someone's identified with their ego, they'll be feeling defensive, and fear's messengers will find anything to blame for their dis-ease. Love's messengers focus on something entirely different. Quote, they will be as careful to let no little act of charity, no tiny expression of forgiveness, no little breath of love escape their notice. End of quote. If we don't fixate on the ego in others, if we're willing to see something as a mistake rather than condemn it as sin, we'll also release love's messengers and our perceptions will shift. Love's messengers, however, can be experienced as fearful as baying hounds because they would herald the end of our special self and the special love-hate nature of our relationships. As the Course states, quote, future loss is not your fear, but present joining is your dread. End of quote. We might fear the future pain inherent in all relationships, but our real fear is of the potential for joining. Quote, for if they joined, each one would lose its own identity, and by their separation are their selves maintained. End of quote. We're also told that only minds can join. So the issue isn't whether we end up in a physical, intimate relationship with someone, but whether we're willing to accept our unity with others by recognising our foundational sameness. So, while we think we fear the pain of relationships, of being torn apart by the hounds of love, our real fear is of letting go of guilt and embracing the innocence of ourself. Quote, "You are not really afraid of crucifixion. Your real terror is of redemption." End of quote. As Kate Bush laments throughout Hounds of Love, "I don't know what's good for me." We can think that the best thing for our happiness is to stay away from relationships because of the pain they elicit. But relationships, in particular the way we perceive and respond to others, also offer us endless opportunities to undo projection and become aware of our guilt, enabling us to undo it through forgiveness. Ultimately, whether we experience them as a hindrance or as an asset in our search for peace depends on which messengers we choose to send forth. And this in turn depends on what our goal is: to reinforce perceptions of guilt and victimisation, or to awaken to the holiness we share. That is the end of the essay. I think one of the main ways you can tell that you're in the ego when you're discussing something with a partner or anyone and the discussion starts to get a bit heated, well, the fact that it's heated, that's an indicator itself. But when you find that you start to really emphasize how you see things against how they see things, and you just keep going backward and forward, both of you just see things differently, and you're trying to get across your point of view, and of course you think you're right, they think they're right. The important thing is to know that there is no way out in that situation, because when we're in our ego, we are in the world of polarities. And it's almost as if whenever we are in our ego and we take on a position, it's like that counter position is automatically generated in the other person if they're in their ego as well. That's just how things happen. You can't get past the opposition when you're both in your ego. You are wasting your time when you're coming from that place. Only when you remember to check in with the Holy Spirit and ask to see the situation through their eyes, which means perceiving your shared interest with the other person first and foremost, and that the form of this dialogue where you're each having different points of view is absolutely secondary. Only then, when you accept some joining on the level of the mind, which means your shared interest in knowing of who you are and your shared fears, it's like that opens a window in your mind to the Holy Spirit's influence. And if that person is able to accept that joining on their mind, you'll find that you'll automatically start to understand each other a little better without having to push your case. And by understanding each other, I don't even mean understanding the form of each of your arguments. I mean just coming to some nicer relationship, a nicer vibe between the two of you, where you can kind of feel that both of you have laid down your sword and there's no longer a battle. There's kind of an acceptance that but neither of you want to continue fighting or having a dialogue that goes nowhere. And it's like the opposition can just fade away. Even what you're arguing about can just dissipate and fade away, and then you just move on. Because as the Course says, we're never upset for the reason we think. We're never arguing for the reason we think. As we've just seen in this essay, we are sending out the hungry dogs of fear to snatch, in a savage search for sin, to snatch any evidence that the other person is in their wrong mind, is an ego, is identified with their body. And that's what we're looking for. So even though we're arguing, we really don't want the other person to come to their senses. We're needing the argument. We think we're trying to change their mind, but even if we do, even if they lay down this and they go, oh, yeah, okay, we'll find something else to argue about with them, because we are on a savage search for sin. Thank you all for listening. I hope it's been of help to you. Tune in again. Bye.